Okay, fantastic. So for this second session of today, we're going to start to look at logic apps, and we're going to look specifically at the Enterprise Integration Pack, also the On-Premises Data Gateway, which is going to be your vehicle for being able to allow cloud applications to talk to your on-premises systems. So most of you probably know who I am, but for the benefit of the recording anyway, I'm Dan Toomey. I'm a principal consultant for Mexia. Also the first employee hired by Mexia when it started 7.5 years ago. Last month I was made a Microsoft Azure MVP, got a few certifications. I've written a couple of Pluralsight courses, including one on hybrid connections, which unfortunately is probably going to be obsolete before long. And if you want to read my blog, that's there, and my Twitter handle. So I want to just start by talking a little bit about integration and why it's so important, and specifically hybrid integration. So digital transformation, it's one of those buzzwords that we've been hearing an awful lot about lately, and it represents a new way that businesses are trying to do things. So they're being innovative about their processes and introducing disruptive kind of patterns. Like take Uber for an example, right? How disruptive that's been in the industry. And at the heart of being able to do that is technology. That's what enables them to do that. The problem is that businesses often, because they want to move fast and they want to keep up with competitors, they need to rely on IT and technology, and often that moves at a slower pace than the business needs to move. So it can take a long time to set up projects and months to get them implemented, and meanwhile they're losing opportunities in their business. So if we look at some of the components that make it up, so apps are huge right now. Everything, I think you can get an app to do just about everything, right, on your phone. Like how many apps would you have on your mobile device, right? Probably the average is about 30, 35. You can probably find an app to go to the toilet for you before long, or at least an app to find a public toilet. That would be a good one for you, wouldn't it? Where's the nearest public toilet? Maybe you could have a rating system, Is it? It exists, does it? There you go. All right. I thought I had an ingenious idea there. So those apps are everywhere, but they're powered by the data, obviously, and the availability of that data has to be ubiquitous because we're so used to being connected now. I mean, we live in a country that, well, has reasonable internet coverage, maybe not compared to some other countries, but we're used to always being able to get online and access what we need. So that presents some challenges. And the underlying backbone of that is integration, because without integration, none of that can happen. So that's why it's become so important. So there's a few statistics from Gartner here. This might surprise you, but the prediction is that by the year 2020, 75% of enterprise systems will be establishing a hybrid integration pattern. That means that they're taking advantage of the cloud and the elasticity and the scalability that it offers. Another potentially surprising figure is that the cost of a mobile app today, 70% of it has to do with integration. And that makes a lot of sense because it's very easy to build user interfaces now, especially with Power Apps and Xamarin. And it's just like with Bootstrap with websites, right? It's very, very easy to get a nice looking user interface up there. But the app is pretty worthless if it doesn't actually have the connectivity to the data that it needs to run it. So integration really gets to be the complicated part of building all of that. And likewise with IoT solutions, connecting all of those devices, a large part of the cost of that would be associated with integrating all of that. So Microsoft's answer to this is to build an integration platform that's both easy to use to facilitate the development of integration solutions, and also to be able to bridge that gap between what's up in the cloud and what's on premises. So at the heart of that platform is Logic Apps and BizTalk Server. So BizTalk Server, a server-based product, it's been around since 2000, Microsoft's most powerful on-premises integration engine. And Logic Apps, of course, is the more recent development in the cloud, which enables you to do connectivity and workflow in Azure. So by bridging the two of those together, you now have your basis for hybrid applications. And that's what we're going to concentrate on in this lab. Wrapping around that, you have API management, which allows you to expose those applications and provide governance and policy and control around that. So you've now had a chance to experiment with that in your first lab and with Ashley's excellent session. The Azure Service Bus gives you a means of creating sort of disconnected or loosely coupled situations by queues and topics, giving you some level of persistence, and also relays, which allows easier connectivity between cloud and on-premises, and we'll talk about that in a later presentation. If you break that up a little bit, Logic Apps actually comes with it a whole host of connectors, which make it easy to connect to your SaaS applications out in the cloud, but also it enables you to connect to all of the Azure services. And Azure is absolutely huge. The amount of things that are offered in there that you can do, everything from storage to data processing to artificial intelligence, machine learning, searching, all of that is available to you and easily connected to by your Logic Apps. So the way it does that is by managed connectors. By managed, it means that Microsoft takes care of those. It's hosted for you. You don't have to worry about, provisioning machines. You simply need to configure them with the right authentication, and they'll work for you. They're really called API connections. So when you decide to add one of these to your application, you configure it for the first time, and then it's available to you to use over and over again. And when I say that there's a lot of connectors, I do mean a lot. So there are over 100 available right now, and I think perhaps a few more were even mentioned yesterday. I didn't get to watch that webcast yet. So if you look at the huge amount there, first thing to notice is look at all the Azure ones that are there. So these are Azure services that you can connect to straight away from a Logic app by provisioning a connector to it. You've also got all of the Microsoft products as well that you can connect to, including the ones that work both in the cloud and on premises. But even despite those, look at all of the other third-party applications and SaaS applications that you can connect to. It's massive. And it's growing all the time. So just talking about the Azure services, I mentioned before all the different things that you can connect to. So everything from storage to data processing. You have functions as well, which enable you to run arbitrary pieces of code. We will be covering that in lab number 4 today. Cognitive services is another really big, huge area that's coming up, and the ability to do things like everything from facial recognition to sentiment processing. So with a Logic app, what you get is you get a very simple user interface to build yourself a workflow. When it first came out about 3 years ago, it was a bit difficult to use, but now it's actually very intuitive. You can start with a template that they give you, or you can start with a blank page and build your own. It allows you, through the connectors, to integrate with SaaS applications as well as enterprise applications that might be living on premises, and which allows you to unlock the value across the cloud and what you have in your own corporate network. It also has the ability to support B2B processes like with EDI and AS2, and that's through the Enterprise Integration Pack, which we'll talk about shortly. So an example, if you had an enterprise application that, say, used Salesforce, which is one of the big SaaS applications, as well as CRM or Azure SQL living up in Azure. So you may make use of those services, and then you might have your own custom APIs that you've developed as well that live in the cloud. But you also have to connect to your on-premises systems, like your line of business system, like SAP, for example, or just a SQL Server or a SharePoint. So Logic Apps is the glue that, through the connectors, that enables you to connect to all of the stuff in the cloud. And then through the on-premises data gateway, allows you to reach down into your corporate network and actually leverage accessibility to those line of business systems for you. So triggering a Logic App instance, there's multiple ways. You can set up a recurring schedule and have them run periodically for you. You can poll an API. For example, you might be able to be triggered for something that arrives on a service bus queue. You can also have an HTTP post request, which is really more the manual process of triggering it. And you can set up webhook subscriptions as well, so that you can have other systems that trigger flows. Supporting Logic Apps is something called workflow definition language, and that defines all of the patterns that you can use as well as the functions. So some of the control flows that you have response, request response. You can do for each loops. You can actually do a split on a message and send it into parallel processing. Do until is supported, and of course conditional statements as well. So you think about the complex workflows that you can build with that. There's also expressions that you can build in. So, for example, you can base your conditions on statements, and there's quite a bit in there. These are just a few examples of it, but there's a whole reference page that you can access that shows the kind of things that you can do. And if you tuned in yesterday to the Logic Apps Live, you would have found out that there's a lot of new stuff that's just been introduced right now. Some of the more significant things in there are variables. So now you can use variables in your workflow, and I assume they can be assigned and things like loops and stuff. Is that right, Adam?
Assignment's coming up in the next release.
Okay.
Like setting a variable.
Setting a variable within a Logic app is coming up in a future release. Another cool thing you can do is generate a schema from a sample message, like an XML or a JSON. So the pace at which this is moving is quite fast. I think they're doing like 2-week sprints, and you get every couple of weeks you'll get a Logic App Live's webcast where they're being very transparent about the features that they're adding to it. So from an enterprise messaging perspective, one of the things that we see all the time is a VETR pipeline. It stands for validation, extract, transform, enrich, and route. So validate would be an example. An XML message comes in and you want to compare it to a schema and make sure that the message looks like the way you want. That's definitely supported in Logic App. Another is extract. So you can take a message and you can decide that I only want part of that message. You know, it might be a single node value that you're trying to get out, or it might be that you've got a wrapper and you want to remove that and just get to something specific in that message to process. Transformation is of course possible using XSLT. So those who are familiar with BizTalk know about the BizTalk mapper that we have. You can build these maps to change one message into another format. For instance, your canonical format, your company, to a vendor-specific format. And you can build those maps in BizTalk, and they are compatible to bring them up with the Enterprise Integration Pack into Logic Apps and use them in your pipeline. Enrich is where you need to actually pad out the message with a little bit more information. So you might need to go call off to a local database, or you might need to maybe translate some reference data, for example, compose a new message from the input that you've had already. And then finally, there's routing, where you can send your message to a service bus topic and actually have multiple subscribers to that. So that's a pattern that we'll look at a little bit later. So the Enterprise Integration Pack includes something called an integration account. And what that integration account is a container for the artifacts that you need to support an enterprise messaging solution. That would include schemas and maps. And if you're doing B2B type stuff, there would also be your trading partner profiles and agreements that govern how you interact with those partners. And it also, of course, if there is any certificates that you might need, you have that as well stored in there. So that becomes important for things like AS2, where you're providing that level of security. How many people in here have done any B2B stuff? Not too many, just a couple, yeah. They're extensible. You can also store your own metadata as well that goes along with those objects. And it's all managed, you know, by the usual methods with REST API, PowerShell, and of course Visual Studio and the portal. And they're expensive. So an integration account will cost you in Australia about almost $1,300 a month for one of those. So it is a little bit pricey. But if you think about the capability that it offers, I mean, building B2B solutions, for example, normally products that can do that, like BizTalk Services, for example, is also a very expensive product. It's maybe not that bad. There are dev and test rates available at half price, but you also get a free development account. The limitation is 1 per region. And that's going to be important when you do your lab. Has anybody here already set up an integration account in their Azure subscription? No. Okay, well, that's not an issue then for you, because if you already had one existing, you wouldn't be able to create another free one in the same region. You'd have to create it in another one. And it is important that they live in the same region as a Logic app. So this is where I had that tip before about try to put everything in the same region. You'll need them in the same to be able to communicate. So Logic Apps gives a great ability for debugging and monitoring as well. Every time you execute a process, you can go in and look at the trace afterwards and actually see what shapes it's gone through and what messages have actually traveled through each one of those steps in the Logic app. And you can see the green check marks mean that this particular flow was successful and everything worked the way you wanted it to. If you have an error, you get a nice red icon for that, and you can then open it up and look at the specific details of what went wrong. So that's all just built in and given to you for free. Now, with these logic apps running in the cloud, you have that ability to connect everything that's in the cloud, and you have the ability to execute these workflows. But in order to be able to reach down into your corporate network and connect to your line of business systems, you need a channel to do that. And that's what the OnPremises Gateway gives you. So some of those connectors that allow you to do that, like for example to save a file or to connect to a SQL server, all rely on the OnPremises Gateway, which you can provision. So the way it works is you install a service that runs on your local machine in your network. And that service creates a connection to an endpoint in the cloud through an outbound channel. And that's how it can get around the firewall issues, because it's difficult to get things into a network through a firewall, but usually not so hard to get out from it. So by establishing that service, you then create an endpoint that's accessible in Azure, and then you configure the connection in Azure and use that OnPremises Gateway to underpin any of the connectors that you need that have to access on-premise systems. So the cloud resources that currently support this are, of course, Logic Apps, Microsoft Flow, which is just built on Logic Apps actually, Power Apps, Power BI, and Azure Analysis Services. And from the other side, from the on-prem side, the systems that it can support include SQL Server, of course, but also BizTalk, SAP, DB2, Oracle, quite a few. And I imagine that list is going to keep growing. So, yes?
So looks like it is connecting to the database side of it. So how about some applications like Fusion or AX? So would I be able to connect?
Yes, because you would use the specific Logic App connector for that particular application, whether it's AX or SAP. There will be a connector that knows how to traverse the protocols for that particular system. And the OnPremises Gateway simply gives it the tunnel to reach it from Azure. So again, using your Logic App to connect all of your SaaS services in the cloud, and you need to reach down into your SQL Server on-premises, you can use an OnPremises Gateway, and that gives you the pipe that enables you to access that. And that's what you're going to be doing in your lab, actually. So before we talk about the lab, are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
When will Microsoft let us build our own connectors?
You can now,
Publish them.
and publish them. So they're working on that, is what I've heard. So the intention is to create a marketplace that you can basically design your own connectors and then be able to monetize and sell them. But I think there's probably a lot of legal stuff to work out around that and how they charge. But I do know they're working on it. So that will be the intention in the future.
So custom connectors can be built now, but they can't be published, and what's the use?
Well, you can create connectors and use them in your own subscription.
Yeah.
But you can't sell
Yes.
them.
Yeah, you just can't sell them to other, third parties. Okay. But that is the intention, that one day you will be able to.
Okay.
In fact, that was a model they were encouraging when they first came out with this, because they wanted third-party people to build the connectors for them, so Microsoft didn't have to build everything. And that was a way of encouraging it. But
Okay, do that.
apparently they didn't. It must have been more complicated from a logistical or a legal issue.
Yeah, it's a pity because they'd end up with thousands of connectors as opposed to hundreds there are today.
That's
and
right.
Every time I go to use a Logic App, there's always a connector that is not there, and I have to build it,
Right.
like Confluence
Yes.
or NetSuite, whatever we use.
So, as I said, there's nothing stopping us from building one now, in the hopes that when the marketplace becomes available, we can then push it up and make money from it. So, just looking at the lab, what you're going to do, you're going to start with a service bus connection, and you're going to pick up a message, and then use the enterprise integration pack to do some processing on that. I think there's some schema validation that you set up there. And then you're going to set up an on-premises gateway so that you can reach down and store your information into a SQL database. So just the prerequisites, I think everyone should have all of this. If you have a BizTalk image running, you should have SQL Server running, right? So is there anybody who doesn't have a SQL Server running that they can use for this lab? What you're going to need to do as part of this lab is import a database that's been created for you, and it's in that package of files that I gave you off the USB. There are some steps in the lab document to tell you how to do that. You'll need to import that into SQL because that'll be used in the lab. So as I mentioned, the steps are, first it's going to have you create your on-premises data gateway, get it configured on premises, and then configured in Azure. And that's a little bit tricky. One of the tricky things about it is that the account that you use for that can't be a Microsoft account. It has to be a work or a school account. So the way you get around that, and there are instructions in the lab, is if you're using a Microsoft account for your subscription, you can create a new account in Azure Active Directory and use that one. So that'll be the tricky bit. As I mentioned, you set up the local database in SQL Server, and then create your integration account and your logic app definition. With the integration account, it's going to tell you to install the Logic Apps SDK, or the Enterprise Integration Pack SDK in Visual Studio. If you do that on your BizTalk server, just be aware that you will not be able to create BizTalk projects in Visual Studio. So unfortunately, that pack and the BizTalk SDK are not compatible on the same machine. So you won't have to develop anything in BizTalk today. So for the labs, that's fine. But if in this particular environment that you're using, you intend at some point to build BizTalk applications, my advice to you is do not install that SDK. All you're going to do in the lab is create a schema. You can do that easily in a BizTalk project. You don't actually need the Enterprise Integration Pack SDK. So just a warning for you. Any questions? Okay. Let's go to it then.